move forward. Welcome everyone to today's special MPRINT webinar featuring Doctors Jeff Barrett and Joe Standing. It's an Ask Me Anything presentation about implementing precision dosing for pediatric patients in a hospital setting. So Professor Joe Standing is a professor of pharmacometrics at the Great Ormond Street Institute of Child Health, the University College of London, and an honorary research pharmacist at Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children. He obtained a PhD in clinical pharmacology and did a postdoc in pharmacometrics at Uppsala University, and then had some fellowships with the Medical Research Council to gain further expertise in statistical modeling and pharmacometrics, and focused on immunology and infectious disease. Joe was an early adapter of the utilization of electronic health records in pediatric clinical pharmacology research. Dr. Jeff Barrett is currently the Chief Science Officer at Aridhia, promoting life science partners to collaborate, access, and share secure data to deliver better patient outcomes. Dr. Barrett began his career with a BS in chemical engineering from Drexel University and a PhD in pharmacokinetics from the University of Michigan, prior to spending some time in academia at the University of Pennsylvania, where he was professor of pediatrics and director for the Laboratory for Applied PK/PD at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Following that, he moved to pharmaceutical industry as Vice President of Translational Informatics at Sanofi Pharmaceuticals, and then has spent time also with Bill and Melinda Gates Medical Research Institute as the head of quantitative sciences, and then also as a Senior Vice President at the Critical Path Institute, serving as the Executive Director of the Rare Disease Cures Accelerator Data Analytics Platform. With that, I will pass the discussion to Dr. Barrett and Dr. Standing to hear a little bit more about using real-world evidence to support pharmacometrics and clinical decision-making.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a delight to be here today to meet with all of you and talk more candidly about precision dosing in general, but also on specific activities that originate from different academic centers of excellence, and have my good friend and colleague, Professor Standing, available to answer questions in a very collegial manner. I'm going to share my screen now and just walk through a couple slides, and then we'll get into this more candidly. So hopefully things are starting to appear for you.
We're seeing your presenter view. There we go. Thanks.
Great. So for many of us as parents, we start out, this is our experience with precision dosing. You have a little one that needs medicine, and then you have to struggle with, really figuring out, how am I going to pour exactly the amount that's in the label up to the meniscus of the line? And if you know too much, you have ridiculous conversations with your spouse about, well, our child is 95% on the weight scale, so I need to go a little bit above the line. And then you just muddle through and then finally find a way to balance your acetaminophen with your ibuprofen. And you learn quickly that PK/PD works in your child in addition to what you see in the label. Luckily, we've had the benefit of time and compute environment development, as well as the accumulation of more sophisticated electronic medical record systems, to make the concept of precision dosing, where this basic information can be abstracted from the electronic medical records and be a source for patient-specific information, in addition to the knowledge provided by the on-site team who has to develop these tools and make them available to the caregiver. So I think, there's a lot of good historical information out there. I myself had tried to do this decades ago at CHOP, but the timing wasn't right. So, and I would say that while we've made progress, it's still not where it needs to be. The good thing, though, is that the community of scientists, clinical scientists, as well as computational science is seeking to evolve this effort, have given a lot of thought to which drugs are more susceptible and which drugs would benefit the patients in terms of this type of guidance. Understanding the disease-specific modalities that really allow us to understand the timing, as well as other clinical variables that are important, and not just focus on a basic pharmacometric model that, say, a sponsor would generate as they work on an NDA, incorporating those patient-specific factors. And then the final column here is implementation. This is where a lot of good intentions fail because the community on site or the caregivers just don't understand this. They're hesitant to really employ this if it's available to them. So the good things don't happen, even though the resources and the expertise may be available. Now, the good thing is that we do have commercial solutions also available, and I highlight a few of them here. These are names that you probably are familiar with. I would say, there's a cost associated with them. They do offer validated solution. The extent of validation is different depending on who you're talking to. And while they all pitch customizability and sharing capabilities, the typical implementations are for single institutions. And I would say the landscape is different in the US versus other parts of the world. So because resources are sometimes available and institutions have the funding to do this, they will sometimes go the effort and acquire one of them. But I'd still say the opportunity is lost to where you have multiple institutions or even networks with the possibility of sharing this information. So some of the knowledge that stays within those institutions is not really shared. And I do also want to recommend or mention that these commercial solutions have done us a remarkable favor by creating quality implementations, by improving the connectivity between data resources as well as the models themselves. So I think this is a step in the right direction, but clearly not everybody can either afford these or have the wherewithal to utilize them in a meaningful way. So it's one option, but it's not the only option. The intention to kind of collect from a traditional therapeutic drug monitoring effort with pharmacometric applications, be they within your own institution or through shared services, is available. This is a graphic that was pulled from a recent paper where they're pitching this whole concept for low and middle income countries. So again, I think the community understands we can't leave people behind here. This is an opportunity to share the information. In my current role, this is a big part of what we're trying to do, is to promote collaboration and to provide a landscape by which this can be accomplished. And this, I think, is sometimes a barrier because, within an institution, typically those hospitals are funded for their just brick and mortar software solutions and don't necessarily have an easy time connecting the dots in this regard. Now, complementary to that, you have a number of very premier institutions doing phenomenal work trying to build these from an academic side. These are academic stakeholders. They have a model development team typically, but not always. But they're seeking to recognize that they can do more for their patients with a full complement and holistic approach to precision medicine, particularly in children. And I'll introduce Joe in a minute, but I think we've done some remarkable work at Great Ormond Street, but this is not the only place where this is happening. What I would say the opportunity here is for these institutions to kind of work with each other, to collaborate more intensively, and to build this as a community of practice where this kind of information is shared in a broad way. Not every institution can develop all these models. There's just too much to do, but it, again, provides an opportunity to collaborate and share. At Aridhia, again, we provide a platform by which this kind of sharing can occur, and recognizing that there's additional data. Sometimes it's not easy to get the electronic medical record data shared in this way. So the ability to generate synthetic data, but also to bring in additional tools. A lot of what you'll see is that we work a lot with open source solutions, but clearly the intention is to think more broadly about bringing validated platforms such as Verisim Life, Puma's, Metworks. All of these are on the plate. We're completely agnostic to the tool, but it's an opportunity to impose the audit trail on governance and reporting such that the security and patient privacy can be maintained. So that's one thing off the plate or concern for using this approach. Again, I'd say that the collaborations are essential for this to happen. This is just an initial listing of where we've made some efforts in this regard. Again, you see a mix of commercial, CRO-based, academic, as well as vendors in the open source and commercial area. So it's clear with the intention of building the connectors and the APIs so that all of this kind of sophisticated modeling can be available to the end user, and they don't necessarily have to have an enormous budget to pull that off. But if they do have existing licenses, that can be accommodated as well. A lot of what also is, I think, a good effort is to nurture some of the open source solution, recognizing that this is a community of practice already dedicated to providing these solutions, improve the quality of them, make them available, make them customizable. Some of the great work being done by Sebastian Wicha is all web-based. We were hopefully going to collaborate more intensively to bring this into an EHR environment so that it can achieve a broader connectivity. And now you have a whole potential library of sophisticated precision dosing models that could be available into a broader context. And then regardless of EHR solution, Epic, Cerner, or otherwise, made available to that community. So that's basically the background I wanted to give you about the landscape for precision dosing, as well as the tools and connectivity. With that, I'll turn it over to Joe, and then we'll have a more candid tete-a-tete discussion.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I just had one slide because, as you say, I think it's most beneficial if we can focus on having a discussion. So can you see my screen now?
Yes.
So at Great Ormond Street, we've had electronic prescribing and administration of medicine since 2010. And that was a big pivot point where we thought, right, now we have an electronic record of each dose that's administered to each patient. We can start to do interesting things in terms of PK/PD. So we've built a lot of PK models, PD models, and PK/PD models from our electronic health system. Latterly, I think since 2017, when we've been working with Aridhia, through this very nice secure environment where we're able to deploy modeling tools such as NLMXR to build the models. What we haven't done yet is to implement model-based TDM, although we've certainly tried to go down this route in a couple of times. And I just want to sort of highlight a few key points that I think would be useful for the discussion. So the first one is to think, why are we measuring drug concentrations in the first place? And therefore, what's the benefit to the patient? So, with aminoglycoside antibiotics and glycopeptides like vancomycin, of course, the original reason to measure levels was safety, to ensure the drug's not accumulating. We've looked at many case studies in our institution where the levels of the aminoglycoside or the vancomycin are the first things to change before the serum creatinine, as Roger Jelliffe always used to teach us. Creatinine is a lagging biomarker for unstable renal function. So actually you can see acute renal failure happening on the drug levels. But more recently, of course, people have said, well, actually, we need to hit an AUC target for efficacy. And whilst this has been based on retrospective and in vitro data, whenever this has been tried prospectively to either adjust doses, to hit an AUC, or, for example, in the recent NEO-VANC study where a high dose was given to babies and randomized to the standard of care, it's not really led to much in the way of clinical benefit. And this is a big problem with antibiotics, that it's really hard to show clinical benefit because it's only beneficial for the patients who have an organism with an MIC that's close to the breakpoint. If the MIC is 3 or 4 dilutions below the breakpoint, any dose will do. And if the organism is very resistant and it's MIC is very high, no dose will do. So to prove clinical benefit at an individual patient level is very difficult for antibiotics. Another very famous example is busulfan. Again, this has largely been derived, the reason to busulfan for therapeutic drug monitoring in stem cell transplant as preconditioning, by meta-analysis and retrospective data. It's not prospective randomized controlled trial to show this works, and we'll probably never have the patient numbers to ever show it. So there's very few actual primary pieces of evidence where we can do a randomized controlled trial and say this level relates to benefit. I think the azole antifungals are probably one of the few areas where you can say a certain trough target should be beneficial. And then the question goes is then after that, do you need a TDM software to do that? For a nice drug with a very long half-life like posaconazole, probably not. But for a drug with non-linear PK, which is quite hard to predict, like voriconazole, a TDM software is probably really interesting. The second point I want to talk about is how do we then integrate this with the electronic health records, and how do we make it usable? Certainly, if we've got electronic health records, we can automate the extraction of dose histories of covariates like the renal function. But with all of this automation, we need some sort of regulatory approval, for hospitals to trust, and for clinicians to trust that these data are being pulled in a safe way. And this is where perhaps some of the open source facilities fall down. This then comes on to the problem of cost. When we've tried to talk to our hospital about having these paid for solutions, we've been told very much that it needs to be cost neutral. So can we show that by implementing this software, we will somehow either not spend any more money, so we'll save the money that the software costs us. And it's very difficult to prove. As I said, if we go back to point one, where's the patient benefit? If there's not a huge evidence, that's problematic. Can we decrease the number of samples we take? Well, there are some studies that show actually using TDM software, people have increased the number of samples they take. So, we can't even save lab processing fees. So I think those are the sort of three main issues that we're up to date. I just want to horizon scan a little bit before we go into the open discussion, in that we've been approached by several companies now who can do rapid diagnostics, who can measure various drugs within half an hour or less as a point of care test. Most of these companies have realized that just measuring the drug level is not too interesting. We need to be able to interpret it. And it's my belief actually that these companies may well be the drivers in future of model-based therapeutic drug monitoring. On a drug-by-drug basis, they will need algorithms that can not only give you a drug level, but then interpret those drug levels. And that comes back to integrating with electronic health records and thinking about how we can gather evidence to show this is going to be beneficial. So I'll stop talking now, and hopefully we can start to have a discussion.
Yeah, I think I really like the bringing up the TDM companies too, because I do think there's a number of players. The landscape is changing, so it's an opportunity for this community to kind of see where there's good science being developed and then just nurture it. Maybe we can open it up to the folks on the call to ask additional questions.
I mean, is there anyone on the call who's currently practicing model-based TDM in their institution? I think one one benefit that has been pointed out to me of doing model-based TDM, whenever we've looked retrospectively at our data, we found several problems. So, for example, we did a big study on our vancomycin retrospective data several years ago, and we found many trough concentrations apparently being taken during the infusion. And speaking to the staff on the wards, what we realized is that they were taking the level, starting the infusion, and then recording everything on the electronic system. So in fact, they were recording a trough time that was actually later than when they actually took the dose, and this wasn't thought to be a problem. So you know, we have these sort of noisy data issues. Of course, if you're inputting data into a TDM software, there's certain checks and balances that don't allow you to enter nonsense data. And actually, what I've been told by people who use these systems is that it actually drives better quality data entry in the first place.
Yeah, it's a great comment. So, Joe, let me ask you on that topic. I mean, this was still the case when I was trying to pull this off 20 years ago, where the Therapeutic Standards Committee or Drug Use Evaluation Committee would have to decide how we're going to manage the process. So even before you got to implementation, there was a lot of discussion around what are the quality checks that we're going to put into place. And I'm just curious from your standpoint, before you actually implement this kind of solution, is how much discussion has to ensue and what kind of championing do you need to kind of get people on the same page?
Yeah, so we have drug policies throughout the hospital, and these are approved by a drug and therapeutics committee. Yeah. And they're written and drafted by the clinical clinicians, pharmacy, and nursing teams relevant to the relevant area, to the relevant areas. I'll give you an example of our sort of antimicrobial guidelines where there are therapeutic drug monitoring in place. We try to be fairly light touch in terms of written guidelines. If the level is this, increase the dose by X%. We try to not to do things like that because, of course, there's many reasons why assumptions of linear pharmacokinetics may not be possible. So yeah, I think in each institution there'll be a process by which you need to go through in terms of how you could get these things approved. But I think they could go very much down the same line as other policies and other apps and software that are increasingly being used for other indications in the hospital.
Let me ask you, in terms of your current environment, what would you say are the biggest obstacles to improving things, and where does the improvement need to occur that moves the needle even more?
Well, the thing that immediately jumps out at me is our whole hospital electronic record system. I won't say which one that we have, but as I said, we did have electronic prescribing since 2010, and this originally was developed from a pharmacy stock control system. And so although it was a bit clunky to use, it was quite well designed, actually. And one of the problems that we've noticed with hospitals in the UK is as they've gone to, I think we had 28 different systems that were all merged into one overall system. These whole hospital systems are not pharmacy systems, and actually they work okay, but they actually, from a pharmacy side, they don't work as well as the old system used to. So pulling data out of the back end, finding out where data have gone, making sure that we've designed the data entry in the right way so that the data flows in the right way has been a really big challenge for us. And we started our new system in 2019, so sort of 4 years ago now. And I'd say it was only in the last year where we've really started to get on top of this, some of these data flows and understanding how best to design things that would then facilitate us being able to do, model-based dose adjustments.
Kind of working with you in that regard, or what's that?
Sorry, it just broke up at the start.
I was asking, I'm sorry, has the EHR vendor been receptive to working with you on this regard? Is that a relationship that you're working on?
To an extent, I've not been directly involved in those discussions, so I wouldn't like to sort of badmouth them too much. But there are so many issues with the system, and with all parts of the hospital having to get things together that it's been a challenge to get the pharmacy and drug dosing issues to the top of the agenda when there were perhaps many other things that were difficult to manage.
God, 20 years, nothing's changed.
Yeah.
How about from the audience here? Let's, Michael, you have a hand up.
I've been involved lately with efforts and community looking at digital twins. How do you see that impacting what you're trying to do?
I think there's a fantastic opportunity. We've got access to huge data sets of real patients, and they're very difficult, impossible to share, of course, to make them really available. I would not say impossible, but it's difficult. And of course, as soon as you can create digital twins that are realistic and can sort of models that can simulate really rich in terms of amount of demographics, populations, I think this will really open up the potential to develop new models and perhaps leverage some new modeling methods in bringing in new machine learning methods to sort of individualize treatments.
Just to expand on that, we're working with a company called Replica Analytics to provide, in general, synthetic data where digital twins is on the plate. But I would agree with Joe, credible digital twins is the issue, particularly with some of the comorbidities and the uncertain disease progressions, particularly in the very young. But I think overall, it's a fantastic research effort and something that we should, as a community, invest in. Anybody else? I'm going to start calling on you.
So I'll ask a question about how you deal with missing data or that incorrect data, right? So the times that were incorrectly recorded or, so forth. How do your systems account for that? Or, one of the issues we've run into with using real world data is, when they've transferred from another unit and we may not have captured the data in the previous unit, or maybe even coming in from home, taking a medication, and we wouldn't have dosing information for prior to the hospitalization.
Yeah, well, it's a huge challenge. I mean, in the simplest case, it's relied on us going case by case manually back to the records, and we're usually working with a team of clinical pharmacists who have access to the system and perhaps know the individual patients in many cases. We do have opportunities, and some of our clinicians who are more sort of tech savvy, to allow the patients to input their own data. So that there's an app, My Gosh, that the patients can actually input some of their dose histories. Our renal team, for example, are experimenting with allowing people to do their own TDM sampling for their tacrolimus, the dry blood spot that then they post off, and they input all their own dose histories and probably more accurately actually than the sort of senior grade doctors that are seeing them in the clinic. So I think that's a something to do. But as I said, I think if we could get to the stage of doing model-based TDM, this sort of forces the hand of people to make sure that the data are plausible and that missing doses are chased up and times are recorded in a more accurate manner.
You got your hand up again?
Yeah, there's another level of complexity that we look at, because we look at both disease and treatment and diagnosis as processes. And if you're looking at data, particularly if you're going across hospitals, how do you manage different protocols because the patients may not have been managed the same way prior to the dosing with a particular drug, or diagnosed even the same way. How are you able to start to take that into consideration in the models? Because that's something we find is a critical factor.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, at my group's research, we've limited things to situations where it's all been a single center. So, for example, we've done a lot of work with the bone marrow transplant, the hematopoietic stem cell transplants, where patient has been probably worked up at the hospital, arrives a few days before their transplant, and then is there for the next 3 to 6 months, and we understand everything. We do have epidemiology colleagues who do a lot of this data linkage. So I think we're quite lucky in the UK that patients have this NHS number. So you can track people across different healthcare providers and pull out their data. But there is still a problem of a lack of standardization of how things are recorded, and a huge amount of sort of regulatory hurdles to get over to, and ethical hurdles to get over to make these data sets. So it's by no means easy.
Let me throw out a kind of a provocative thought, and just to get your opinion, particularly Joe. We're exploring the use of bot technology to kind of look at this issue of data quality, and exactly what Michael was alluding to, looking at plausible versus implausible data that's being collected. I mean, the bot technology is really mature now. It's unfortunately a lot of advances for nefarious purposes, but I think this might be a good application, particularly looking at cross-institutional differences and ones that make more sense, as opposed to things that just, speak to a quality concern. But it's still in the very early proof of concept stages. We're working with a couple other commercial vendors, but I think if you have this kind of confluence of data coming into a shared environment, that could be a solution. It's going to need some tweaking, though, and validation.
I mean, I think technologies that can give us more confidence in the data and to do data cleaning will be real game changers. I can just think of this paper we did relatively recently with a group of CF clinicians at the Royal Brompton, and so their electronic health records were not so advanced as ours, and I think it took probably 3 months to collate the data for this posaconazole therapeutic drug monitoring study of a handful, maybe 50 patients. And then, they were mainly trough concentrations, and they were all adolescents who were taking a single formulation of a very long half-life drug. So the modeling, even though the student was relatively inexperienced, took an afternoon, because we have to fit a one compartment model. There's nothing else you can do with it. You fit the model. Do the parameters look reasonable? Yes. Do some simulations. So, by far the biggest time-consuming, commitment in that piece of work was to collate the data.
Yeah. Cindy, any thoughts from you? People are shy today. Go ahead, Cindy.
Hi, Jeff. Hi, Joe. I had a question about one of Jeff's barriers, which was trying to prove or show that benefit of these model-informed strategies. What would you think is like the ideal situation to finally get this off the ground and show some benefit?
I think it'll be different for each drug. I know when I was working on this for pediatric oncology drugs, we were looking at length of stay as one economic metric, because if you could discharge the patient sooner, then you keep your costs down, and it's a benefit to the patient and the overall health economics of it. Again, it requires prospective validation for you to do that, not easy to show, and there's an expense associated with actually collecting that data and showing it. So, but I think more of those types of economic evaluations where you're really lowering costs and then still improving patient outcomes need to be considered, but it'll vary based on the drug and the therapeutic window.
I mean, I think, to me, the whatever we say about real world data science, that what really shifts the dial in terms of regulatory approval is the pivotal randomized controlled trial. And if we look at the busulfan example, I think everyone's fairly convinced that we should, change the dose of busulfan into that AUC target range. But historically, it's been down to a public funder to fund that trial, and there's lots of other things public funders could do, and I think a couple of people have tried, but they've never managed to do it. Now, let's say you've got a diagnostics company who's now got a device that they want to register and show that they can measure busulfan or and not one of the other drugs in conditioning, and it can output a dose recommendation, perhaps after 3 samples, within a couple of hours, rather than the current method is take almost a full AUC, at least 4 time points. Some places take 6 to 8 time points, send them to the lab, quickly process them that evening, do the dose recommendation the next day and change the 3rd dose. A company perhaps could, I don't know if any of them are doing it, run a relatively small randomized controlled trial just to show this works with fewer samples, sort of a non-inferiority, compared with the standard method, and then actually prove that, it's, and have a licensed product for that. And then that would shift people onto using it, because, that in the end, what we found is that the economic case has to be made at some point to bring in new technologies.
Anyone else?
So what, I mean, maybe Jeff, I could ask you about the, 'cause you've talked about the platform being agnostic to software, and while I feel like the open source solutions like NLMXR for modeling are fine. We've recently submitted an LMXR model to FDA for a submission, and whilst the sponsor did ask us to verify the final model against non-mem, I think essentially, and we did, and it was fine. I think the point is, as long as you can verify the model against the data, and the data are well collected, great. But yeah, one sort of slight concern I have with this is that, NLMXR and R is updated all the time, and then the version changes and everything. In 2 years' time, I'm concerned if I went back to try and rerun that model on the new version of everything, there may be some changes. And so, you have to have this sort of historic versioning, which, becomes problematic when you're talking about a medical device that you're relying on to give consistent results day in, day out. So I think that's why, as you say, these commercial companies have come along and made products that they've then done some validation testing on.
Well, Joe, from a capability standpoint, one of the things that we're able to do in a workspace is to take kind of a snapshot in time for an environment that was used to build a model. So keeping things with certain versions of our packages, for example, and then, looking at the transfer as you clone that and then update everything with the more recent versions, you can kind of compare as the underlying packages evolve over time or change, just the fidelity of those predictions as you move environments. I mean, I think this is one of the big advantages of these other compute platforms such as a Metworks or a Pumas, is that they deal with the validation of their own compute environments separately. So, again, we're looking to not take any tools out of people's hands. So providing connectivity to those platforms, if people have licenses and choose to use them, that's part of at least what we're trying to do, so that, the habit and the opportunity to do this isn't hampered. We're focused on the open source solutions because, we recognize the cost benefit to this community and the big advantage in having this kind of shared collaborative environment together. But we also have to recognize that at some point, some of these costs will be part of this brick and mortar landscape. Hopefully that hospital IT organizations, as well as other academic centers, have over time. It's just hard to accommodate everything. There's so many moving parts to this. At some point, you just got to pare down and say, this is a reasonable approach. So, and that's why I think I give the commercial solutions a lot of credit, because they've dealt with this. My only concern is that they still have to validate every EHR system and make sure that it works the same way. I'm not entirely convinced that the level of validation is exactly the same as, say, a pharma company or you would have to do seeking regulatory approval. It's part of a conversation that I think this community needs to have more candidly.
And the other thing I was hoping to explore today is this idea of the law of diminishing returns. Of, we've got this electronic data lake of thousands and millions of patient episodes, but at what point is enough data enough in terms of making predictions? I think there was a publication from the Insight RX guys where they actually showed that if they had a very simple model, I think it was another vancomycin one actually, where they just said, look, we'll start off with a very simple model. It might have just some basic allometric scaling, bit of a maturation function, might have creatinine in the model, that's it. And then we then train it on 50 patients from the new institution. The predictions then were just as good as, a model that was based on 2,000 prospective patients, maybe really rich data and everything. And actually, maybe we can get too excited about collecting masses of data when and lose sight of making a good enough prediction.
I think it's a good point, but I would kind of challenge us a little bit with the fact that, more of the same data is not informative. But I worry that if you kind of constrain this to high-income countries or countries that have the infrastructure, then you potentially miss some diversity in data types from other parts of the world. We've seen this already. Some groups have worked with EHR systems in remote parts of the world to find patients with rare diseases, for example. But the standard of care is different in these geographic regions, as well as some of the underlying disease etiologies and comorbidities. So it's not only a volume issue, it's also a diversity of issue. And that's really hard to know what you don't know. So I think a balance needs to be struck. But I agree with the sentiment on the volume. More of the same data doesn't help.
Yeah.
Michael.
We use a knowledge graph approach, a novel way of developing a knowledge graph so that we can address the complexity. One of the things that we deal with is the fact that the data, even in the EHR, when you go by data fields, as a lot of the data scientists do, it may not mean the same thing, even though it has the same label. So, one of the examples we use is glomerular filtration rate, where you have 5 different algorithms to compute it, and 2 of them use a race factor. So that you can't compare the numbers, but they're all labeled estimated GFR. So there's a definite issue that the annotation in the EHR is not necessarily adequate.
Yep.
Your point about other countries, I ran a breast cancer center for the Department of Defense. And if you look at things like TMNN scores, and you look at how they're determined and evaluated, where in the West you have a lot of screening, your distribution of T-scores is going to be very different than in a country where you don't have a lot of screening. And so how you actually use that to do stratification or staging could be very skewed because of something like that. And then the other issue that we deal with is the fact that things like diagnostic criteria change over time. So how a patient have been diagnosed 3 years ago may actually not have this equivalent diagnosis today when the guidelines have changed because of the addition of new technology. So we think those are issues that can confound a lot of the analysis. And that's why we have encapsulated them within the knowledge graph so we can deal with those, as well as things like the difference in protocols and so on.
Yeah, these are great examples. And you just reminded me, last week I was at an FDA meeting looking at pediatric renal insufficiency. And in that case, you have a whole litany of equations that allow you to kind of adjust doses to a population that's not well studied, but where the caregiver has to make adjustments. And we had George Schwartz, among others, there in the audience, and the proponent of a single equation for this indication, but recognizing that there's so many subpopulations within that broad category. So you've got a family of equations there, and you can imagine their default mental decision support system that is not written down, but is actualized by that community on how to use which equation for which setting. It just creates this kind of opportunity, kind of outside of the TDM world, but not entirely, where this kind of precision dosing approach could be broadly applied, recognizing that even within this very small population, there's nuances and differences that are really not accommodated. And you're data poor in many of them, not all of them. And then there's still the necessity of leveraging the adult experience into pediatrics. So that's a different issue somewhat, but I think it also kind of points to using the best information and technology at your disposal, and then bringing to bear, how do you give individualized guidance when you need to very fragile patients, and in a setting where you don't necessarily have time to look something up in a PDR or lexicon, and you need something, at 2:00 in the morning to give guidance on dosing. It's a big problem. Great comment.
Yeah. So then another thing I wanted to ask about as well is what people feel about how to give the predictions. So something we've thought about is, do you give the point estimate? Because that's, most of these software are not fully Bayesian. They're making a maximum a posteriori prediction. So you'll get a point estimate. So then do you run a lot of simulations to try and get some sort of confidence interval on that? Or do you use a fully Bayesian approach where you can get a confidence interval? And a very interesting point that was made by Diane Mould recently, who's done a lot of this work, especially in biologics, was that some of the dashboards that she was designing, she spent a huge amount of time in generating a prediction interval, and the end users didn't want it. They only wanted the final answer. They didn't, the best answer. They didn't want to know about the uncertainty, because that led them to have uncertainty about their decisions.
Same experience where when we provided prediction intervals or simulations, then people lost confidence. Well, then you really don't know. They want to be just told the answer and then not deal with the uncertainty. And I think, we need to listen to this community. How do they want? I would think, and as I'm sure you and mothers on the call, that giving people an idea of what is reasonable would be helpful. But I think for them, that has to make a quick decision. It's not. So, but I don't know what the most informative way of allowing them to appreciate the risk of doing something or not doing something is that helpful. It doesn't seem to be, but I think we need to hear from that community what they would prefer.
Yeah.
But others, please chime in.
I think I've run out of all the discussion points that I'd sort of prepared.
Yeah, I finished my list too.
Yeah, if you want to make some closing remarks. Or...
Well, from my standpoint, I just like to thank everybody who dialed in and participated in this. I think this is was a great discussion, and Michael and others who participate or contributed questions. I think it's a very provocative area. I think technology is improving and evolving in this area. We need to kind of learn from each other in this regard. I think hopefully this is an opportunity to revisit this and get hear from more people, more diverse end users. I know this is not something that single institutions are doing entirely on their own. And, I know Joe in particular is doing a lot of collaborative research. So there's always an opportunity to learn from each other. So thank you for your participation and happy to follow up. I put my email in the chat. So if there's any other information I can provide, just let me know.
Well, I can say thanks a lot for the invitation as well. And yeah, very happy. There's no point us all working in parallel and, duplicating work at different centres. So really happy to, if people want to get in touch and start some collaborations.
Thank you to both Dr. Barrett and Dr. Standing for joining us today for this discussion. And hopefully we'll make some more progress in the future so that in 20 years we can say we've actually maybe have this happening in our healthcare system. And it's a normal and not an abnormality to have therapeutic drug monitoring and pharmacometric support for clinical decision support integrated into our EHR systems. So, thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks very much.